The next day, Cyan got on the carriage. He wasn't alone as he was also accompanied by 6 intermediate class knights. Just before he left, Emily appeared and addressed Cyan as young master. She told him that she was very disappointed with him. Cyan turned his head to the side and while looking at Emily through the carriage window, he explained that this wasn't his fault since he could only bring a knight escort to the academy. Upon hearing this, Emily got angry. She closed her eyes, clenched both fists tightly, and told him that he should have warned her beforehand. Cyan reached out his hand through the carriage window and said goodbye to Emily. He asked her to be good. She crossed her arms, turned her head to the side, and asked Cyan to be good as well. Cyan gave the order for the carriage driver to start moving, and slowly they began to distance themselves from Emily. Emily, upon seeing Cyan actually leaving just like that, closed her eyes, clenched her fists tightly, and while crying started screaming and asked Cyan not to feel bad, even if he was being harassed at the academy. After saying this, she began waving goodbye to him and asked him to take care of himself. Upon hearing this, Cyan simply closed his eyes and with a joyful smile, he thought that saying this was very typical of her. When Cyan was 8 years old, he fell ill. He was so sick with fever that he would lose consciousness repeatedly. Unfortunately, there was no one to take care of him. The person who carried him on his back and ran towards the nearest doctor at that moment was Emily. After running in the rain for several minutes, Emily arrived at a doctor's office, who quickly opened the door and asked her to come in. She placed Cyan on the bed and then began to dry his sweat by placing a damp cloth with cool water on his forehead. Thanks to Emily, Cyan was able to recover from the fever. If it hadn't been for her, he would have been found dead somewhere in the mansion. Thinking about this, Cyan stuck his head out of the carriage window, closed his eyes and with a pleasant smile, asked Emily to behave well because otherwise she would end up dead by his hand. Upon hearing Cyan's words, the knight who was accompanying him became somewhat confused. Emily was someone whom Cyan valued. To him, she was more than just a simple maid. Emily closed her eyes and with a smile, raised her hand and began to say goodbye to Cyan. Cyan crossed his arms, closed his eyes, and simply started smiling. Then, slowly, he began to open his eyes and while looking down with a lost gaze, he started wondering why there were 6 intermediate class knights just to escort one person. When thinking about this, Cyan sighed. Then he turned his head to the side and while looking at the knights through the carriage window, he smiled and thought that things were going to get ugly before he could even reach the academy. Several hours later, it was dusk and Cyan and the others arrived at a forest. At that moment, one of the knights signaled to the other knight and they all stopped. Cyan, who was lying in the carriage, noticed that it had stopped. He sat back up, and a knight approached the carriage. He addressed Cyan as young master and suggested camping here for the night. Cyan asked the knight where they were, to which he replied that they were currently in the central city called Saffron. He also added that they would probably arrive at the city tomorrow morning. Cyan thought it was a good idea to camp here for the night, so he turned his head towards the knight and asked him to let him know when they finished setting up the camp. The knight nodded and replied that he understood. Cyan began to stare at the knight and realized that he was lying, as there was no forest like this near Saffron. This wasn't a pleasant and shady place either. They were in the middle of nowhere, so it was quite obvious to Cyan what the knights were trying to do. Several minutes later, the knight asked Cyan to get out of the carriage. Without thinking twice, he got out of the carriage, put both hands in his pockets, and as he approached the knights, he looked sideways and told them that the air in this area was quite refreshing. Once he got out of the carriage, the 6 knights surrounded him and began unsheathing their swords. While Cyan had his hands in his pants pockets, he asked the knights who was behind all this. At that moment, no one said anything. Brian simply stood there silently observing, and several seconds later one of the knights started to smile. Upon seeing this, Cyan began to look at them all with a murderous gaze and reminded them that he had asked them a question. The knight started unsheathing his sword, and while staring directly at Cyan, he began to smile and replied that he didn't need to know the answer since anyway, he was going to die soon. Another knight also started unsheathing his sword, and as he approached Cyan, he said it was a shame that things had come to this point. Another one of the knights also began to unsheath his sword, and as he approached Cyan, he started to smile and told him that they had no personal feelings against him. He also added that he would be kind enough to make it as painless as possible. Cyan simply turned his body towards the knight, lowered his head, placed both hands on his waist, and remained silent. The knight approached Cyan and asked him to do the only thing he needed, stay there with his eyes closed. The knight gained momentum and attacked Cyan, while slowly the blade of the sword was getting closer to Cyan's neck. He simply stood still. At that moment, the knight's head flew through the air. Several seconds later it fell to the ground. One of the knights turned his head towards the lifeless head of the other knight and went into shock. While Cyan held the demonic sword Karam in his hand, it began to emit an evil energy. He asked the knights who was behind all this. All the knights turned their heads towards Cyan, and upon seeing the powerful energy emanating from his body, they began to feel immense pressure and couldn't help but feel fear. While Cyan's body was emitting an evil energy with a murderous look in his eyes, he started looking at the knights and asked them why they weren't moving. Then he pointed the demonic sword at them and asked if they hadn't expected this to happen. Brian was in shock as he couldn't believe what his eyes were currently witnessing. One of the knights gained momentum and tried to attack Cyan from behind. But in the blink of an eye, Cyan ended his life. Then, he started attacking the other knights. While he was distracted, another knight attempted to surprise him with an attack. However, Cyan moved at incredible speed and evaded him. He then threw the demonic sword at him, causing it to impale his back and ultimately ending his life. Upon witnessing this scene, Brian couldn't help but shed tears of fear. As he stared intently at Cyan, he began to wonder if he truly was just an 11-year-old child. Cyan extended his hand to the side, and the demonic sword flew back into his hand. He slightly turned his head back, and while his body emitted a powerful energy, with a murderous look he began to stare at Brian. Upon seeing this, Brian started to feel immense terror. Cyan approached him, and he began to cry. Finally, he realized that there was a reason why Cyan had come back alive after fighting a dragon. He didn't take long to come to the conclusion that this mission was doomed from the start. Cyan stomped on the ground, causing Brian to fall down. He began looking at Cyan and thought that his death was near. Cyan approached him, put a hand in his pocket, placed the demonic sword on his shoulder, and while staring into Brian's eyes with a murderous look, ordered him to tell him everything he knew. Without thinking twice, Brian revealed to him that Mrs. Margaret was behind all of this. Seeing how easily Brian had revealed this, Cyan became somewhat confused and thought that this had been too easy. The next day, both set off for the academy, with Brian driving the carriage and Cyan sitting on top of the roof. On the way to the academy, Brian explained to him that from what he had heard, Krantz had asked a favor from Mrs. Margaret, so they all assumed that this mission was because of that. Upon knowing that Krantz was behind all of this, Cyan thought that for this reason, all he could do when he saw him was run away. Now that he knew this, he decided to teach Krantz a good lesson when he saw him again. While he was lost in his thoughts, Brian caught his attention. Cyan turned his head towards him and while looking at him with a serious gaze, asked him what he wanted. While Brian was driving the carriage, he started looking down with a sad look and asked him what was going to happen now. He closed his eyes, turned his head towards Cyan, and asked if he was going to kill him. Cyan began to stare at Brian and told him that he didn't seem so sad about it. Upon hearing this, he started looking down with a lost look and explained to Cyan that they were the ones who had tried to kill him first, so he had no right to be resentful if he killed them. Cyan simply crossed his arms and thought that Brian was good at driving the carriage. He ordered him to focus on driving and also explained that there was a difference between being useless and not having value in being alive. Upon hearing this, Brian turned his head towards him and was somewhat surprised. He began to stare at Cyan, and while tears were streaming from his eyes, he thanked him. Cyan caught his attention and while looking ahead with a look of surprise, he was left speechless and told Brian that they had already arrived at the central city, Saffron. In front of them stood the city of Saffron, surrounded by walls and with a large castle in the middle. Several days later, the news of the death of the 6 intermediate class knights who were accompanying Cyan reached the mansion. Upon hearing this news, Margaret threw a vase of flowers to the ground, shattering it into pieces. While her hand was trembling, she asked the butler what it meant that one of the knights was missing, and the other 6 had been found dead. The butler placed both hands behind his back, slightly bent his body, began to look down with a lost gaze and replied to her yes, and also added that young Master Cyan had left Saffron 10 days ago. Upon hearing this, Margaret was shocked. She placed a hand on her face and while looking at the butler with eyes of surprise, reminded him that as he himself had told her, this was not going to be a problem. After saying this, she asked him how it had come to happen. The butler bowed before her and explained that they had underestimated Cyan. Upon hearing this, she extended her hand to the side and, while glaring angrily at the butler, asked him how he could fail to get rid of a little child. The butler started sweating and, looking down at the floor, explained to her that he believed there must be someone behind the scenes whom they were unaware of. He told her that if she gave him another chance, he would send someone to the academy. Just before he could finish speaking, Margaret interrupted him. She approached the butler, clenched her fists tightly, and while staring into his eyes with a furious gaze, she told him that if they did this and failed, then Cyan would lay hands on her beloved son Krantz. At that moment, she remembered the words Cyan had told her about not wanting to see Krantz graduate in one piece. Upon remembering this, she clenched her teeth tightly and began to feel anxiety. She turned her back on the butler and as she was walking away from him, she gave him the order not to do anything. Upon hearing this order, the butler bowed his body, placed a hand on his chest, and responded that he understood. Margaret slightly turned her head back, and while staring directly into the butler's eyes, she ordered him to eliminate anyone who knew about this matter, as they couldn't afford for it to come to light. Several minutes later, the butler left Margaret's room, and as he was closing the door, Ashel's subordinate began spying on him from behind a corner. At the same time, in the carriage on their way to the academy, Cyan lay down on his seat, placed both arms behind his head, closed his eyes, and thought that 10 days had already passed since they had left Saffron. During all this time, Brian had been acting as his subordinate. Cyan assumed that Margaret now knew he was not dead. At this rate, he thought he would arrive safely at the Royal Academy. He began to think about what he was going to do with Brian once they arrived at the academy. Several hours later, Brian opened the carriage window and informed Cyan that they had already arrived at the academy. Upon hearing Brian's voice, Cyan simply opened one eye and responded that he understood. This brought him back to the old times. Although he couldn't call them good memories, this academy had changed him in many ways. Several minutes later, Cyan entered the academy, went to the reception desk, showed them his badge, and introduced himself as Cyan Vert from the Vert Dukes family. Upon seeing Cyan's badge, the receptionist stood up, and while searching for something in the drawer, she turned her head towards Cyan. With a look of surprise on her face, she explained to Cyan that he was already registered, so he just had to go to the assigned dormitory and wait. She also added that he would have to attend the entrance ceremony and the elemental test in 2 days. Cyan became somewhat confused upon hearing this. While he was putting the badge inside his suit, he stared at the receptionist and began to wonder if he had heard correctly. The receptionist took out an envelope with a red badge and a dormitory key and placed them on the table. Upon seeing this, Cyan became somewhat confused and asked her if she was sure there hadn't been any mistake. Several minutes later, both of them arrived at Cyan's room. As soon as they entered, Brian dropped the luggage on the floor and was left speechless. The room that the Royal Academy had assigned to Cyan was the Royal Hall. It was a gigantic room that contained everything. Upon seeing how big the Royal Hall was, Brian was left speechless, while on the other hand, Cyan put one hand on his waist and the other behind his head and remembered that no one in his family had been assigned to the Royal Hall. Therefore, he quickly came to the conclusion that someone was behind all of this. Cyan put his hands in his pockets, turned his head towards Brian and asked him if this was all the luggage. Brian, who was still in shock, replied yes. Cyan put his hand inside his suit and while looking at the ground, told Brian that now that he had arrived at the academy and all the luggage was ready, there was only one thing left to do. After saying this, he began to stare at Brian with a serious look and told him that his role was already done. Upon hearing this, Brian's expression changed drastically. While he was looking at Cyan, he started sweating and trembling, as he thought something bad was going to happen. But to Brian's surprise, Cyan took out a bag of gold coins and handed it to him. While Brian was holding the bag of gold coins with both hands, he became somewhat confused and asked Cyan what this was. Cyan turned his back on Brian, and as he was walking away, he waved goodbye and explained that he had given him the bag of gold for all the work he had done so far. He also added that this money was enough to help him start a new life wherever he wanted. He also explained to Brian that those who had sent him could end up killing him, so he advised him not to return to Velia's. As Cyan walked away from him, Brian simply remained silent for several seconds. Then, he got down on his knees, and upon seeing this, Cyan turned his head back and was somewhat surprised. Brian began to stare into Cyan's eyes and told him that he, Brian Kendrick, an official knight of Velia's, would like to serve him for the rest of his life. Upon hearing this, Cyan became confused. He turned his head back and asked Brian if he was truly a knight. He had always thought that Brian was just a carriage driver. Brian replied affirmatively. He also added that he was the lowest of the low among knights, so he was assigned tasks such as driving carriages. After saying this, Brian started looking down at the ground and explained to Cyan that his father always used to tell him that if he knew someone he could trust and serve for his whole life, then he should ask to serve them without hesitation. Cyan began looking down at the ground and told him that this was really foolish to do. Upon hearing this, Brian became somewhat confused, raised his head, and asked Cyan what he meant. Cyan started approaching him, and while his body emitted a suffocating energy, he began staring at Brian with a murderous look. He clenched his fist tightly and asked Brian how he would know that Cyan wouldn't stab him in the back in the future. Brian got nervous and replied that even if Cyan stabbed him in the back, he wouldn't care. Cyan approached him, put a hand on his shoulder, and asked him to never consider betraying him. After saying this, he opened the door of the Royal Hall, and as he was walking outside, he asked Brian to stand up and accompany him to the elemental test since he didn't want to go to the entrance ceremony. While Brain was crouched on the ground, he turned his head towards Cyan and replied that he understood. At the same time, in the office of the Dean of the Royal Academy, the Dean, who was sitting in a chair with both arms resting on the table, explained to a girl with purple hair who was standing in front of the table that they had many talented students in this year's elemental test. A few hours ago, in the room where the elemental test was taking place, students began to climb onto the stage to take the test. Among the students was Aaron Severus, who had a 2-star mono rank, had a B in physical rank, and a 52% light element. Another student who took the test called Seth Chakin had a 3-star mono rank, had an A in physical rank, and a 71% sand element. While the dean was looking at the reports, he thought that these kids were quite impressive. Among all the students, the one who caught his attention the most was Cyan Vert. When he stepped onto the stage, he showed everyone that he had 1 star in mono rank, had an S physical rank, and a darkness element of 92%. The instructor from the academy named Sarika Nigrathi began touching her glasses with her hand and explained to the dean that even Alice Vert, who had been titled God's Child, had 88% in water element when she graduated. The dean of the Royal Academy was called Kundal Quaisel. Upon hearing what she had just said, the dean thought this was quite interesting. He began to stare at Sarika and told her that even the girl who was praised for possessing top talents could not match her younger brother. Just as Sarika was about to talk about Cyan's dark element, the dean interrupted her and explained that Cyan's talents could be corrupted, considering that his element was darkness. He left the reports on the table, stood up, turned his back to Sarika, and asked her if she knew that Cyan Vert had been assigned to the Royal Hall. While she was holding a book in her hand, she replied yes and explained that she had found out about this from the other instructors. At that moment, the dean revealed to her that the order to assign Cyan to the Royal Hall had been a direct order from the Emperor. Upon hearing this, Sarika was shocked. While the dean was looking out of the window, he explained to her that Cyan had saved the young princess from monsters on the front lines. He also revealed that the Emperor was even considering engaging them both. He asked Sarika what kind of consequences she believed there would be if the 5th princess, who was considered a failure, married one of the Verts who had never failed in raising extremely talented individuals. Upon hearing this, Sarika put her hand on her face and explained to the dean that succession conflicts would intensify, causing the empire to potentially divide over the issue, which could lead to a civil war. The dean slightly nodded his head towards her and asked her not to dwell too much on this since all they could do was observe. After all, it was up to them whether Cyan would become the hero of the empire or cause its downfall. At the same time, while Cyan was walking down the hallway of the academy, he thought that this time he had obtained a percentage of 92 in the elemental test. He remembered that in his past life he had obtained a percentage of 80. He began to wonder if this increase was due to him having drunk all that demon beast blood. While Cyan was walking down the hallway, he turned his head to one side and saw Krantz. Upon seeing Cyan, Krantz became nervous and started to distance himself from him. Behind him was another much larger student, who had his hands in his pockets, and upon seeing Cyan, he began to give him a murderous look. Cyan thought it was truly shocking for Krantz to see someone he believed was dead. The student approached Krantz and asked if Cyan was the boy he treated as his slave. While Krantz was sweating due to fear, he turned his head towards the student and answered yes. This student was the son of Marquis Penarin from the kingdom of Garam, named Popper Penarin. While Popper was staring at Cyan, he began to smile and told him that he had heard that he didn't even know who his mother was. Popper was someone who had bothered Cyan as much as Krantz in his past life. Cyan began to stare at Popper with a murderous look and couldn't help but smile, thinking how lucky he was to know him now. Popper placed a hand on Krantz's shoulder and asked him to move since someone like Cyan needed a good beating. Upon hearing this, Krantz became nervous and asked him to wait. While the two of them were conversing, Cyan began to stare at them with a murderous look, while his body emitted an evil energy. Popper felt Cyan's murderous gaze and asked Krantz why he was looking at them in this way. Krantz knew that something bad was going to happen. While he was looking at Cyan with a fearful look, he began to reach out his hand towards Popper and advised him to go to the cafeteria. At that moment, Cyan approached Popper and gave him a strong kick, causing his body to hit the wall. Seeing this, Krantz was in shock. This is the end of the video. If you guys want to see the next part, then don't forget to subscribe and like the video.